So with that, I'd love to introduce you to Dr. Anthony Hood, who is a leader in inclusion. Dr. Anthony Hood serves as Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Officer for First Horizon Bank. In this role, he leads the development and execution of firm-wide strategy for embedding DE&I into the DNA of the organization. Dr. Hood has received several awards for his community-based efforts, including the Power of Leadership Award from Alabama Power Company and the Community Game Changer Award. His work has afforded him opportunities to host fireside chats with the likes of Apple CEO Tim Cook and to take selfies with business gurus such as Warren Buffett. He is a highly sought after keynote speaker and has developed and led over 100 talks in just the past few years on topics such as building effective teams, community engagement, conflict management, cross-sector collaboration, and entrepreneurship. We are really fortunate to have him with us today. Welcome, Dr. Hood.
Thanks so much, Robin, and hello, everyone. I've really enjoyed the slate of presentations today. It's been really good. I certainly appreciate the comments that Simeon made around social impact and community engagement. I think it leads very well into what I'm going to talk about today. So again, thank you to Filene for inviting me to present today. And also shouts out to my academic colleague, Dr. Robertson, who I've known a very long time in this field. I've only been in my current role for a couple of months. I currently serve as the Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for First Horizon Bank. I started that in November, but prior to that, I spent the last 10 years as a professor in the Collette School of Business at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. I've also served in the President's Office as a Director of Civic Innovation for the university. And that is a role that was primarily focused on what is the university's role, responsibility in engaging with our community, engaging with all types of stakeholders, corporate community, elected officials, residents, so on and so forth. And so I learned a lot through that role, and that really provided me a lens, I think, through which I see a lot of the work that I'm doing today, and you'll see some of that come out in what I'm going to talk to you about today. So the title of my presentation is Putting the Community Back in Banking. And, I think the title can be misleading because it assumes that community is not in banking. And we know that all of our institutions have community, very centered to the core of what we do, in addition to our employees and our associates. But I want to start with a definition of what is community. And so I looked in Merriam-Webster dictionary and I saw community defined as a body of individuals who have common interests, people who live in a particular area, people who coalesce around a common characteristic, people who have professional interests. But I think the definition that really stood out to me was community is a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. And I think that really stood out to me when I was preparing for our talk today. And so think about that when you're thinking about how you personally, as well as your organizations, think about community. Do you have that feeling of fellowship with others? And who are the others? And so for me, when I think about the others, certainly I'm thinking about my coworkers and the employees in my organization, but also our customers and the clients that we serve. But I'm also thinking about those local residents, the people who live, work, learn, play, and serve in and around our facilities of our organization. But I'm also thinking about those social service agencies, those nonprofit organizations, particularly those that focus on human welfare, those that focus on financial inclusion and helping people thrive in our communities. But I also think about those elected officials because we know the legal and regulatory environment, both at the local, state, and federal level is changing. And it's important for us to have relationships with those folks. So when I think about community, I'm also thinking about them. But then I'm also thinking about broadly, I'm thinking about our industry peers. I'm thinking about the roundtables that I have joined in the last several months, composed of other people who are doing diversity work, people who are doing community work. Those communities have been incredibly important for me because, spoiler alert, I'm not a banker. Before I was an academic, I was an engineer. And so I'm learning a lot about banking. and then having this coalition of other people who are experienced in my field, who have overcome challenges around how do you embed this work into the community. I think about those people as part of my extended community as well. So you think about where we are today, at the time of this recording is June 2021. So I'm thinking about all the things that have happened over the past 18 months, the past year and a half since the beginning of 2020. How has community changed for us? And how has our sense of community changed? And how has our stakeholders, how has their sense of community changed over the years? So let's kind of recap, because I think this provides some really good information for what we're going to talk about today. Clearly, we had a health crisis last year because of COVID, and we're still not out of it. We're still in it at the time of this recording. But this health crisis really laid bare a lot of the inequities that exist in the communities in which we serve. We also see the inequalities and the feelings of exclusion, particularly those people who have been excluded from having adequate access to health care. These are people that come into our branches every day, people that we engage with when we walk to lunch from our various locations. These things have had an impact on our businesses and on the people that we serve. But we also know that this COVID also drove a crisis as relates to loneliness and isolation for a lot of people. You think about the people who, for some people, coming into that bank branch, once a month, once a week. Some people may come in every day just to get, a couple dollars for lunch. Those people were no longer able to do that, at least for a time. And how did that impact them? And how did it impact their mental health and well-being? But then COVID also drove an economic crisis. We know that a lot of businesses did not fare well because of the crisis. I saw a stat recently that 41% of businesses, I think they're owned by African Americans, either have closed or may still close because of this crisis. So we know that communities of color were hit hard by this, but then we also know that women and other people who are caregivers, both of children, of people who are sick, as well as the elderly, they were also impacted very hard because a lot of these people were more prone to work in essential jobs. And so it had an impact on their ability to be able to keep employment. So we know that now that we are kind of moving into a recovery phase, we know that recovery is oftentimes is uneven. You think about the shocks that we had back in 2020. You think about the financial collapse that we had in 2008, 2009. A lot of folks were just recovering from that last crisis, and now we've been hit with this. So we know going forward that recovery is going to be uneven for the people who are in the communities that we serve. And then we also know that access to local and federal funds was also distributed unequally, because those people who began with a higher baseline of resources were better able to access PPP and other types of funding that were provided. And so even through the recovery and the resilience process, there are inequities and exclusion. And then we had the social unrest, the murder of George Floyd. We also had the killing of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. You know, this created a lot of tension in our communities, and it also forced us to reimagine the role of policing, particularly community-based policing. You know, how did policing start, and where has policing moved to now? And so we're thinking about that. And then, of course, we have these corporate statements affirming our organization's support for the lives of our Black customers, the lives of our Black employees, as well as in the communities in which they live, learn, work, play, and serve. And as a response, we've seen a lot of organizations, some of yours included, have made significant investments and commitments in addressing and redressing a lot of the inequities and exclusions that exist in our communities. And because of that, companies are now being held to a higher standard of both transparency, accountability, and responsibility in our communities. So what is our response? And a lot of our companies have also responded by enhancing, you know, the way that we clean our locations, as well as how we deliver our services. So we've had a lot of customers now that have had to adopt to digital banking technologies, which for a lot of organizations has been great. And so what you've seen is that a lot of our organizations have announced consolidation of bank branches, which is going to have a huge ripple impact in our communities. Then we're making investments in digital technologies, and we're investing in the upskilling of our employees to be able to adequately deliver on those technologies. And now that we're going into this return to work phase where a lot of our, particularly our back office employees, were able to work from home for the last year or so, we're now returning to work. And so now we're having conversations around the great resignation, around there's some people who either are unable or unwilling to go back to working 40 hours a week away from their homes, away from the people who they have to provide care for. And then we're seeing an increasing war for talent, labor shortages, as well as the cost of human capital is increasing because of increases in pay. And then lastly, we've seen a change in administration, particularly at the federal level, and we're hearing now there is a lot more focus on things like ESG, CSR, DEI, and Community Reinvestment Act. All these things are having impact on the work that we do every day, but also in how we show up in the communities in which we serve. And that last point, when you think about ESG, CSR, DEI, and CRA, a lot of these different acronyms, particularly in my organization, we are thinking about, are these separate programs or are they one and the same? And how do we make sure that if they are separate, how do these things work in collaboration and complement each other so that they are not disparate types of programs? And I think this is something that your organizations as well, if you're not thinking about it, you also need to be thinking about it. ESG, environmental, social, and governance, where does that overlap with our corporate social responsibility initiatives? And how does that overlap with our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then also how we reinvest in our communities through who we give home loans to and our impact and our investments in low to moderate income communities and our support for affordable housing, all these things that typically come under the program of CRA. How do these things blend together? Who's leading these initiatives, and how do we present a united front to the communities in which we serve? So here are some of my thoughts. One, all of these things have to be enterprise wide. For me particularly, I sit in our human resources department. And although DEI sits in human resources on the org chart, we are very clear in our organization that DEI is not an HR program. DEI is something that goes across the organization and really has to be and is embedded in every aspect of our organization: marketing, communications, procurement, lending, deposits, investments, HR, tech, operations. It has to be. In the same way for our CSR efforts and as well as our ESG efforts. How do you have that enterprise wide approach? And so I think that's the lens through which we have to look at our community engagement efforts. So none of these things should belong to any one group. It may sit somewhere in the organization, but it has to be embedded all across our organization. We can't look at them as programs. They have to be strategic priorities, and they have to exist at the company's overall strategic plan and have to be embedded in those metrics, those goals, those targets, and then how we evaluate them. So I want to talk about what I'm calling the 5 R's. And these 5 R's are strategies through which we can embed community, we can embed DEI, CSR, ESG into everything that we do. So I'm going to tell you that the 5 things are: we have to resource it, we have to recognize it, we have to reward it, we have to rep it, and we have to recruit from it. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are things that I just want to lift up for you to be able to take back to your organizations to make sure that you're implementing this. So let's start with the first one. And so the first one is, how do we resource it? So resourcing community engagement. Number one, we have to have dedicated resources to be able to support community engagement. If community engagement is not a part of our strategic plan, it's not going to be resourced. So making it part of our overall strategic plan is a means through which we make sure that we dedicate resources to it. And then also we need more people like Simeon who have an actual title to be whatever the title: community impact officer, social engagement, director, VP of community engagement. When I was at UAB, it was called civic innovation. No matter what title you put on it, you have to have somebody who is dedicated to that work in order for it to be effective. And it can't be, this is what I do in addition to something else that I do and I only spend a certain percentage of my time focused on community. It has to be somebody's 100% job to focus on that if it's going to be done effectively. And not only should you give that person a title and dedicated time to do it and effort, you also have to have a dedicated budget for that. And you have to think about, are there inequities in the budget that we provide for community, CSR, ESG? Are there inequities between the size of that budget and the size of the budgets of other things? My colleague, Dr. Tira Charles, she said in a TED talk, if your company spends more on maintenance of facilities and window washing than you do on things like DEI and community engagement, that's a signal of your priority. And I like the term or the quote, budgets are moral documents. And so I can look at your budget and see what your actual priorities are. And so we have to look at our budgets and make sure that there aren't inequities between how we treat things related to community and how we treat other aspects in our organizations. This person or this team that is dedicated to community engagement, I say team very intentionally because it can't just be one person. That dedicated budget needs to have allocation for other people to be a part of it. Um, that team needs to be in charge of partnership development, going out actually into the community and developing partnerships with all those stakeholders I mentioned earlier, the nonprofit organizations, the elected officials, the social support organizations, the colleges and universities that are critical to our talent attraction and talent development activities. That takes work. That takes time to develop trust, develop relationships, follow up. You need a team to be able to do that. And you also need dedicated people on that team to do the data analytics and the insights to be able to do that work effectively, to manage our progress, and then to have people who are liaisons to all the other aspects of the enterprise. So resourcing community engagement is critically important. I'm also thinking about how do we reward our work in community. So the second thing is community engagement has to be a part of our annual evaluation of our employees. Is there a certain segment of our annual evaluation so that our associates and our employees know that if we do these things, then we will be rewarded for the community engagement activities that we're involved in? Employee volunteering, employee charitable giving. How do we reward those things? If you have a leadership competency model that kind of lays out, career development plans and how people can get promoted in the organization, how do we put a community lens on that to say these are ways that you can demonstrate leadership that has an impact both internally but also externally to the organization, and then that be a part of how we evaluate and reward um, performance in our organization. And then it goes without saying, but I will say it, that evaluation has to be tied to compensation. We can't evaluate things over here, but then don't tie it to raises, rewards, merit, and things like that. So tying evaluation to compensation is incredibly important. We also have to recognize it. So do you have awards, whether that's monthly awards, quarterly awards, or annual awards for people who are going out and being a leader in the community? And these are things like serving on nonprofit boards. Uh, this is things like engaging in alumni association, things like international organizations like Kiwanis, Rotary. These are ways that if people are engaged in that activity, particularly if it's extracurricular, then you need to make sure that you are rewarding that. And this could be like an employee profile that you put into the company newsletter. These things go a long way with making sure that we are championing and rewarding the things that our associates are involved in. And then also membership in professional association and communities. And then outside of our local community. So things like Filene, engaging in the activities and events that Filene is doing, engaging in that content, and then bringing it back and doing lunch and learns with other associates is incredibly important. And then being engaged in other organizations like Opportunity Finance Network, Society of Human Resource Management. I think these are other ways that we can encourage our associates to engage in community, but again, making sure that we recognize the things that they do out in the community. From a company-wide corporate standpoint, I think our organizations need to be pursuing these annual awards, things like Diversity Inc. or Human Rights Campaign. Our local business journals oftentimes have a top 25 or top 50 companies for community engagement or diversity. Oftentimes these awards require once a year, you have to gather all your information and then submit nominations, and you have to demonstrate the things that you've actually done to be able to get on those lists. It takes a lot of work to get your package together, but what I'm finding is that this is time well spent because it gives you targets to be able to shoot after to make sure we know what we're doing internally and how that benchmarks to what other organizations are doing, both in our local communities as well as maybe on a national level. But again, this is why it's important to resource our team's internal because somebody has to be tracking that work, reporting that work, and then being a liaison to all the different aspects of the enterprise. Because oftentimes these recognition programs require you to submit things on procurement, on loans, deposits, credits, your internal programs like employee resource groups, your engagement councils, so on and so forth. You guys are fortunate to have a resource in Filene for credit unions because they already have the research on what are the industry best practices, the industry averages. You can use those as targets and benchmarks through which you can make sure you know where you are right now, as well as where the industry is, and identify those gaps and use that as a target through which to guide some of your community engagement activities, as well as your DEI types of activities. And then also on the individual level, a lot of the local business journals or things like American Banker that have these individual awards for best banker or most engaged. These are other opportunities for us to highlight our employees, submit nominations on their behalf because these things bring really goodwill back to our organizations. And then we have to rep it. All the great work that we're doing, both internally as well as external to our organizations, we need to brag on ourselves. And oftentimes we don't like to brag on ourselves, but it's really important that folks out in our communities know what we're doing. So it's important that we are partnering with marketing to make sure that we have what I call a good social media game, to make sure that you are doing storytelling, you're capturing really good content about what we're doing in the community, and we're posting that on Facebook, on Twitter, even on TikTok, YouTube, Vimeo. These things have a huge impact not on our community members feeling good about the institution they bank with, but also on our future talent because talent wants to work for organizations whose values align with theirs. And particularly our younger generations that are coming up, they value community and social impact, and they value diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the more that we can demonstrate the grant making that we're doing, particularly the grants that we make to organizations that are expanding equity and inclusion in the communities that we serve, we need to capture that content, make a profile of those that we're making grants to and the impact that they're making, or the sponsorships that we're making to organizations in our community. Or if we have really good procurement stories around a minority or a woman or a veteran owned business that have come through our supply chains, find a story that somebody's doing really good and then do some storytelling around that and share that with your clients, your community, and as well as your associates. These things drive better retention of our internal talent, but also serves as a talent attraction mechanism for our organization. I know most of you have an annual report, making sure that you are investing a lot of time, energy, and effort in ESG, CSR, and DEI, and how that shows up on your annual report. And then make that annual report dynamic. So more than just having something that you can print out and hand out, but having a dynamic place on the company's website, yourcompany.com/community, and have it where you're constantly updating that website. And now when your bankers are going out and calling on customers, they can direct your uh, potential clients as well as your current clients back to the website so they can understand real time what's going on. I know what a lot of people in my community are finding is that when our bankers are going out, they're calling on people and they're saying, "Hey, I love to bank with your organization, but tell me what you're doing in the community. Tell me what you're doing to expand diversity, equity, and inclusion." And so having marketing materials, having a website that you can point those current and potential clients back to is going to go a long way with making sure that we're successful in our efforts. And then the last thing that I would mention, the last R, is we have to recruit for community engagement. So sometimes we need to go around to our employees and make sure they understand what the opportunities are externally in our community for service. So again, it goes back to that community engagement team to actually go out and do a scan of the organizations that are doing work that aligns with those of your credit union, and then going internally and seeking out associates that already have some type of inkling or leadership capabilities in that standpoint and say, hey, our local housing authority has a opening on their board. I know that you're doing some work and you have a passion for affordable housing. Would you mind if we nominate you for service on this board? So recruiting our associates and actually helping to be a matchmaker for opportunities in our community, I think will go a long way to make sure that we are successful at embedding community back into banking. And so with that, Taylor, I will open it up if we have any questions from our participants.